It's been 20 years since Israel last fought a war in Lebanon, a war that it lost. Not by its own admission, but the impact of it would haunt Israel and Israel's military for years.
Because we have created a deterrent in the war in Lebanon. They can shoot anytime they want.
It would shatter its image of a military superpower in the region, and it would signal to its rivals that it wasn't invincible, that it could be defeated. But this loss had nothing to do with military might or tactical advantage. It came down to a brutal but ultimately failed military strategy it called the Dahiyeh Doctrine. In short, Israeli generals believed that if they inflicted enough damage to Lebanon's civilian population, that ordinary people would rise up and overthrow Hezbollah. But that simply didn't work. So let's talk about what did happen in 2006 and why Israel just hasn't learned from its past mistakes. My name is Mohammed Hassan, and this is The Big Picture.
وستبقى اسم هذه الحدود اللبنانية الفلسطينية. وبالنسبة لنا لن يكون هناك يوم نقول فيه أو نعترف فيه بحدود لبنانية إسرائيلية.
Hezbollah came into existence specifically to fight Israel. The group was formed in 1985 in the midst of Lebanon's bitter civil war, just 3 years after Israel had invaded and occupied South Lebanon. Its members were young Shia fighters from working-class neighborhoods inspired by the anti-imperialist revolution that had just taken place in Iran years earlier, which brought Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini to power, vowing to take on America and its proxy allies in the region. Hezbollah focused its fight on the Israeli presence in South Lebanon and Israel's ally, the Lebanese Christian South Lebanon Army. Its guerrilla tactics would continue until 2000, when Israel's army was forced to withdraw under pressure from the international community, who was outraged by its military tactics in the south. By now, Lebanon was in ruins, with little means of protecting itself from the outside and little power to control the armed groups that had emerged within it. Hezbollah had become one of the most powerful political and military forces in Lebanon, and its charismatic leader, Hassan Nasrallah, claimed victory over Israel after 18 years of occupation and vowed to continue fighting.
هذا النصر نقدمه لشعبنا المظلوم في فلسطين المحتلة. إن إسرائيل هذه التي تملك أسلحة نووية وأقوى سلاح جو في المنطقة والله هي أوهن من بيت العنكبوت.
But despite Israel's withdrawal, tensions along the border continued for years. Israel also retained control of key farmland in the south, something that Hezbollah really wanted back. Nasrallah himself was under tremendous pressure inside Lebanon, especially after the assassination of Lebanese Prime Minister Rafiq al-Hariri in 2005. Many people pointed their fingers at Nasrallah, but Nasrallah blamed Israel. Then in 2006, Hezbollah launched what was meant to be a small contained operation into Israel's northern border, an operation he called Truthful Promise. On the 12th of July, a group of Hezbollah fighters snuck through the border fence and attacked an Israeli military patrol, killing 3 soldiers and capturing 2. The idea was to use these soldiers as bargaining chips for the release of 4 Lebanese men held in Israeli prisons. But it didn't work out like that. Israel immediately sent in a tank after the soldiers, but that tank was blown up by a landmine, killing another 4 soldiers. And so, in response, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert declares an all-out war.
Israel is determined to carry on the fight against Hezbollah. We'll reach out for them, we'll stop them, and we will not hesitate to take the most severe measures against those who are aiming thousands of rockets and missiles against innocent civilians for one purpose: to kill them.
Backed by the United States, Israel launched an air, land, and sea invasion of Lebanon. In the first few days, its air force bombed and destroyed Beirut airport, took out dozens of bridges, thousands of roads, as well as hospitals, schools, power stations, and residential buildings. Its navy fired on Lebanese towns and cities and its tanks and soldiers entered the south once again. Hezbollah responded by firing rockets into Israeli cities, most of them indiscriminate and untargeted. On the ground, however, its fighters had a big advantage. They were well trained, they were armed with anti-tank missiles and night vision goggles, and they used tunnels to navigate a battlefield they understood very well. Frustrated by their inability to fight effectively on the ground, Israeli generals resorted to a campaign of psychological warfare. They dropped thousands of leaflets on Lebanese neighborhoods, telling people that Nasrallah and Hezbollah were just using them as puppets to serve the interests of Syria and Iran. Lebanese TV channels are hacked to broadcast images of dead Hezbollah fighters and Israeli raids. Residents receive computerized messages on their phones warning them to evacuate, and then their buildings and homes are bombed. Cluster bombs and white phosphorus are fired into civilian neighborhoods in violation of international law. On the 30th of July, Israeli airstrikes leveled a 3-story residential block in the village of Qana, killing 28 people, half of whom were children. The army claimed that it was responding to a Hezbollah rocket site, but to this day, there's never been any evidence to prove that that site had any significant strategic meaning for Israel.
תושבי לבנון, גם אלה הכועסים עלינו ועל צבאנו, על הנזק העצום שנגרם לכם כתוצאה מהמלחמה הזאת, שלא רציתם בה ולרובכם אין בה חלק ועניין, יודעים היטב כי האויב שלכם איננו מדינת ישראל, אלא השייח נסראללה וחבורתו, שהיו מוכנים להקריב חיי רבים מכם כדי לשרת אינטרסים של מדינה זרה.
But there was something else going on behind Israel's public statements. A retired Israeli colonel at the time told the Washington Post, Israel is attempting to create a rift between the Lebanese population and Hezbollah supporters by exacting a heavy price from the elite in Beirut. The strategy was large-scale destruction as a way to pressure the Lebanese people to reject the message of Hezbollah. It would become known as the Dahiyeh Doctrine, named after the Beirut neighborhood where Hezbollah's headquarters were located. Dahiyeh was completely leveled by Israeli bombing, and large craters could still be seen years later. This would become a blueprint for how Israel treated every conflict from this point on. They used it in Gaza in 2008, 2014, 2021, and we're seeing it in action today. An Israeli defense analyst would later describe this new way of thinking. Israel again will not be able to limit its response to actions whose severity is seemingly proportionate to an isolated incident. Rather, it will have to respond disproportionately in order to make it abundantly clear that the State of Israel will accept no attempt to disrupt the calm currently prevailing along its borders. And indiscriminate attacks became its modus operandi. An Israeli general told reporters where to attack. Once inside Lebanon, everything is legitimate. Not just southern Lebanon, not just the line of Hezbollah posts. This strategy was a disaster for Israel's public image abroad and undermined its argument that it was pursuing Hezbollah as its main target. But despite Lebanon's repeated pleas with the international community to force both sides into a ceasefire, the United States was blocking it on Israel's behalf. Former UN Ambassador John Bolton said that the US government wanted to give Israel as much time to take out Hezbollah's military capabilities as possible. But after a while, the US became disappointed by its failure to do so. Only then did the US step in, and on the 11th of August, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 1701, calling for a ceasefire, Israel's withdrawal, and the disarming of armed Lebanese groups operating south of the Litani River. During the 34 days of fighting, more than 1,000 Lebanese civilians have been killed, as well as 44 Israeli citizens, 120 Israeli soldiers, and more than 250 Hezbollah fighters. Both Israel and Hezbollah claimed victory, but who actually won? An internal Israeli commission slammed Prime Minister Olmert's decision to invade Lebanon, concluding that he had no clear plan for what he wanted to achieve and how he would do it. The Winograd Commission also found that despite the overwhelming force Israel used and the superior military that it had at its disposal, that a small paramilitary force was able to not only hold them off, but drag them into a ground battle they ultimately lost. Hezbollah chief Hassan Nasrallah also said he regretted carrying out the operation that sparked the war, saying he was surprised by Israel's response.
سأليني إنه طيب لو كنت 11 تموز بتحتمل ولو 1% إنه عملية الأسر بتوصل لحرب كالتي حصلت بتروح بتعمل عملية أسر بقولك لا قطعا لا.
After the war, UN peacekeeping forces were deployed to southern Lebanon, but Hezbollah refused to disarm. In fact, its arsenal has only grown since 2006. It remained the strongest force in the country, wielding both military and political power in Lebanon's fragile state. The Lebanese army, unable to assert its dominance in South Lebanon and fearful of stoking sectarian divisions, couldn't pressure Nasrallah to dismantle his growing militia. Hezbollah were initially praised as heroes across the region for their fight against Israel, but that reputation would sour after the Arab Spring, when Hezbollah fighters were sent into Syria to help Bashar al-Assad quell a popular uprising. Israel continued to call on Resolution 1701 to be fully implemented, for Hezbollah to disarm completely, but they themselves have been accused of violating Lebanese airspace thousands of times. So when the war in Gaza erupted after the events of October 7, Israeli generals immediately implemented the Dahiyeh Doctrine. Its planes devastated the civilian population in Gaza as a way to deplete Palestinian morale, to destroy their infrastructure, and importantly, to make sure its soldiers never got caught off guard on the ground. But has that strategy worked? In Gaza, Hamas fighters mimicked the tactics Hezbollah had used in 2006, including tunnel warfare and anti-tank missiles. 12 months on, Israel's own generals admit that their stated aim of destroying Hamas is an impossible goal, with fighting in northern parts of Gaza persisting despite the death of more than 41,000 Palestinians.
Hamas is an idea. Hamas is a party, and it is implanted in people's hearts. Whoever thinks that we can demolish Hamas is wrong.
Fighting along the border with Lebanon also reignited with Hezbollah, launching rockets in solidarity with Gaza, forcing Israel to evacuate its northern towns once again. Then in September, Israel took the fight back into Lebanon with a week-long campaign of airstrikes that has so far killed close to 2,000 people and an air, sea and land blockade imposed on the whole country.
أنا مش بس عندي خوف من اندلاع حرب كبيرة، أنا عندي خوف من ما ينتهي لبنان على الآخر.
لا ما اتوقع على اساس منطقة آمنة، أكيد هون منا جبهة حرب، هون في عيال، في ناس، في نسوان، في أولاد صغار.
مجرمين، ما عم بقيتوا ناس عم حامل سلاح وبواريز وماشي، عم بقيتوا ناس مدنيين.
إذا فات بيكون فتح قبره بإيده يعني، هالمرة إذا فات ما له طلعة يعني.
The most devastating attacks took place in the same neighborhood where all of this began. Dahiyeh. On the 27th of September, more than 80 bombs were dropped on a single block of residential apartments in the densely populated suburb near the Hezbollah headquarters. Hezbollah's senior command, including Hassan Nasrallah himself, were killed in the attack, and Israel celebrated this as a victory.
אזרחי ישראל, אלה ימים גדולים. אנחנו במה שנראה כנקודת מפנה היסטורית.
But what has it actually won? For one thing, Hezbollah maintains that its military capabilities are still intact and that it's ready to face off another ground invasion.
ستواصل المقاومة الإسلامية مواجهة العدو الإسرائيلي مساندة لغزة وفلسطين ودفاعا عن لبنان وشعبه وردا على الاغتيالات وقتل المدنيين.
And Lebanon, with nearly a sixth of its population displaced and facing continued aerial bombardment, is still in no position to disarm Hezbollah or impose Resolution 1701.
بدوري أطالبه اليوم بالعمل الجاد والفوري لضمان انسحاب إسرائيل من جميع الأراضي اللبنانية المحتلة.
Hell is breaking loose in Lebanon. We need this ceasefire now.
I don't believe there's going to be an all-out war. I think we can avoid it.
הפגיעה הקשה בחיזבאללה בכל הגזרות, בביירות, בבקעת הלבנון, בדרום לבנון תימשך.
Meanwhile, the international community, with very few exceptions, has turned on Israel and decried its tactics, its Dahiyeh Doctrine. Despite the political and military cover provided by its US ally, Israel has grown more and more isolated. You can see this in the overwhelming vote at the UN General Assembly last month, that its occupation of Palestinian territories is illegal and must end. But Israel's government remains defiant. It's rejected months of ceasefire proposals in both Gaza and now in Lebanon, and its generals believe that they can secure their borders through military might alone, and that by inflicting unimaginable and disproportionate horror on a civilian population in Lebanon, they can recreate their deterrence against any future threat. But the question is, if that didn't work in 2006, why would it work today?